So, with the end of the Cavalier Parliament comes the Exclusion Crisis. A number of events led to the Exclusion Crisis. Mainly the fact Charles did not have any legitimate children. His son, the Duke of Monmouth, was important in the army and well liked, but he was illegitimate and Charles would not name him as his heir. Therefore, Charles's heir is his Catholic brother, James. It is public, very public, that James is Catholic and has been in the public knowledge since 1673. As Charles II gets older, they worry that, Charles is going to die and then they're going to have to deal with this Catholic king. At first, they're not too worried about that because James himself is old and they think, oh, he won't last very long. But James remarries Mary of Modena, who is Catholic, and therefore they think that James is going to have a son. James already had two grown-up daughters, and they were both Protestant, Mary and Anne, because James had been Protestant when he brought them up. So, in the eyes of Parliament, once Charles is dead and once James is dead, then the throne will pass to Mary, who is married to William of Orange and is therefore going to make the country Protestant and will have a Protestant lineage. However, with James marrying Mary of Modena, it makes it seem that if he did have a son, and Mary was young, if James was to have a son, that son would become the heir, and therefore there would be a Catholic line of succession. So this is starting to get more worrisome as Charles gets older. Also, what really triggers all of this is the Popish plot. Kind of anti-Catholicism had been bubbling away during Charles's reign, especially when Charles gets involved with the French, things like the Treaty of Dover and going to war against the Dutch. So that kind of anti-Catholicism had been causing problems with Parliament. But actually, the general public were more concerned with the kind of Quakers and other dissenters, really. They were more worried about them. But the Popish plot changed that. The Popish plot, this kind of fake, non-existent reported plot to kill Charles II, make England Catholic again and put James on the throne, it creates mass hysteria and panic. Now, Charles knows that, and that's why he executes 35 Catholics, even though he knows the Popish plot wasn't real. But he thinks by executing 35 Catholics, he believes that it's enough. He believes that he's going to be able to get people back, on his side and not let the anti-Catholicism go mad. Things look like they're about to calm down, and then the Coleman letters are discovered. Coleman was James's secretary, and he had been writing to the Pope. So he'd been writing these letters to the Pope. None of them just discussed killing Charles II, but just the fact that James's secretary Coleman is in touch with the Pope, this kind of, again, this just proves in people's minds, this proves that James cannot be trusted and that James will make England Catholic and he must be kind of stopped. So it's really the Popish plot that really pushes everyone over the edge. Now, the Cavalier Parliament, which had been in place for 18 years, since 1661, when the Cavalier Parliament has gone, because obviously Charles dissolves them to try and prevent them impeaching Danby, because he's worried that then his secrets will come out, like the secret Treaty of Dover. Didn't make any difference. They impeached Danby anyway, and he ends up spending 5 years in prison, and he never gives away Charles's secrets. But the Cavalier Parliament was over. However, Charles is in quite difficult money situation at this time. The Third Anglo-Dutch War was over, but he still had a lot of debt from that war. And as you know, with Charles, his spending was completely out of control. And even though in the later Cavalier Parliament, Danby had made some really good improvements to Charles's finances, such as collecting customs duties directly, Charles's debt was increasing all of the time. So he still needs money. So in the years 79, 80, and 81, he actually calls 3 parliaments because he wants money from them. But those parliaments have a specific thing that they want from him, which is exclusion. And what exclusion meant was that they would exclude James II from the line of succession. So he would not be allowed to be king. It would almost kind of skip him and go to his daughter Mary. She was a Protestant, she was married to a Protestant, and at that time they had no reason to believe that Mary wouldn't have any children and that they would become Protestants as well. That does not happen. William and Mary never have any children. What then happens is exclusion. There is 3 exclusion bills introduced into Parliament, each one in one of the exclusion parliaments. At first, Parliament start to discuss the idea of just limiting the powers of James as a Catholic monarch. So they kind of accept, right, we're going to have a Catholic monarch. Why don't we should limit their powers? But that was kind of just before, as the Popish plot was happening. When the details of the Popish plot come to light, the fact that James's secretary Coleman was writing to the Pope, this is Parliament, they firmly decide that exclusion is what they want and is the only thing that they will accept. So in the first exclusion Parliament, Parliament introduced the exclusion bill to exclude James, and Charles is furious like, how dare you try and prevent my brother becoming king, and he just dissolves Parliament. However, the following year in 1680, he still needs money. So he calls Parliament again, and Parliament do exactly the same thing. They introduce another exclusion bill to exclude James. This time it's passed in the House of Commons and goes to the House of Lords, where it's rejected, and Charles once again dissolves Parliament. Furious, he's feeling that obviously his brother's power is being attacked, but also his own, because they're trying to tamper with the monarchy. The third exclusion Parliament is really interesting because it was held in Oxford, and Charles does that tactically because he has a lot of support in Oxford. The people of Oxford really support him. And on the day of Parliament opening, there was lots of cheering in the streets for Charles and in favour of Charles. Now, even though the third exclusion Parliament was held in Oxford, the exclusion bill is actually passed by both houses, the Lords and the Commons, and both houses of Parliament agree that Charles should be excluded, James should be excluded because he is a Catholic. Think about the fact that this is not actually going to do anything to Charles, but he is outraged that they're trying to do this to his own brother. And although it passes through both houses, it passes through the Lords, it passes through the Commons, Charles once again dissolves Parliament. Now that prevents exclusion. So simply, why did exclusion fail? Well, it failed because Charles dissolved Parliament 3 times. That's why it failed. However, there is more to this, because the reality is, people could, if they'd wanted to, they could have started an uprising against this, and they don't. So that is another reason why exclusion fails, is because other than trying to do it in Parliament, the people of England are not willing to go to any other lengths to stop James becoming king. Now, the whole kind of exclusion crisis also brings about the creation of the Whigs and the Tories. Under under the years of kind of the Cabal and Danby, we have the emergence of the court and the country parties. The court parties who side with Charles, and the country party who are against Charles. We have a similar thing here, but they are different. The Whigs and the Tories are slightly different, but it's the same thing. You're getting two political parties emerging. Now, the Whigs support exclusion. They are the ones pushing for exclusion. They're very, very anti-Catholic, and they're very, very anti-James. And they believe in social contract. So they believe the monarch rules by this idea of social contract. And they think that therefore it's justified to get rid of a monarch who wouldn't respect the wishes of the people. So the Whigs are arguing James's religion means that he's broken the social contract, and therefore he can be removed. But they're very anti-Catholic. Interestingly, the other group who actually are against exclusion and they support Charles and James are the Tories. But the Tories are also anti-Catholic. Both political parties are anti-Catholic. However, the Tories do not want exclusion, and it's because they believe in divine right. So they believe that, yes, they're not happy about James being Catholic. They are anti-Catholic, but they don't think that the people of England have any right to exclude someone because they think it goes against divine right. And the Tories and Charles managed to convince the public to support that point of view. The Tories and Charles used massive amounts of propaganda, reminding people of the importance of following divine right, and reminding them of God and their religious beliefs, and the importance of abiding by divine right. That's what they focus on. Whereas the Whigs and their propaganda, they focus on Catholicism and anti-Catholicism, and it more scares people than anything else. That their propaganda is really, really quite scary. Whereas people look to the propaganda from the Tories, and it reminds them about safety and security of the church and following divine right. And the Tories managed to win people over to their side through that kind of pro divine right. They don't really talk about the Catholicism thing because they know that people don't support Catholics, and neither do they. But they focus on trying to remind people of that kind of security and stability of divine right and the king and the kingship. And, Charles, especially by putting the third exclusion parliament in Oxford, he's convincing people, like he's proving to the Whigs, look how much support I've got. The people across the country were supporting him, the Tories are supporting him, and the people of Oxford are supporting him. Yes, there was more Whigs in Parliament, but across the country there is a lot more Tories, and there was a lot more people on that side. And therefore the Whigs did give up. Once Charles dissolves the third exclusion parliament, that's it. The Whigs can either find another way to try and exclude James through some kind of uprising, or they can just go home. And the Whigs realise across the country, yes, there was a lot of anti-Catholicism, but more people were supporting their king and supporting divine right, and therefore they just sort of have to give up. And that's why exclusion fails. Charles is also very clever. Once exclusion has failed, he then releases a declaration to be read from every pulpit, so from every church, that reminds people of the horrors of the Civil War and reminds people what happens if you go against your king. And it's kind of that message like, yeah, keep supporting me if you want things to stay stable. So exclusion does fail at the time. And Charles thinks that he has safeguarded his brother's rise to the throne. Following exclusion, we have arbitrary rule, which is what we call Charles II's personal rule. And this lasts from the end of exclusion to when he dies in 1685. This is an interesting time period and really useful to talk about in an exam, because it's actually quite a big it's different. It's a contrast to early on in his reign. He does have to make some compromises, but generally he is a powerful king in this period. And early on in the Cavalier Parliament, there's a lot of examples you could look to where he's actually kind of failed, whereas he's been really quite successful in this last bit of his reign. So he doesn't call Parliament for these 4 years, and that is actually allowed because even though the Triennial Act was still in place, it was just a suggestion, not automatic. So he wasn't breaking any laws by not calling Parliament. Financially, he was doing well. He got £115,000 per year from France to not call Parliament. So he made this, and obviously Charles had been wanting agreements with France for his entire reign, and he'd had some alliances with France at various times, but France had fallen out with him following the Third Anglo-Dutch War and all this sort of dual policy. Whose side is he on? Is he on the Dutch side? Is he on the French side? But France say to him, if you don't call Parliament, we'll give you £115,000 a year, because France see the English Parliament as a threat. If the English Parliament are in session, England might do something against the French. So he's getting this money. He also continues to improve the tax collection system that Danby had started. This time it's excise taxes being collected directly. So not the customs duties, which Danby had already brought in. It's expanding that to the excise taxes, which are taxes on goods within England. And his income rises through these kind of improvements, but also a trade boom at the time. He improves his income to about £1.3 million per year during arbitrary rule. So he's doing absolutely fine. Obviously, he's at peace as well. He's not at war in this time. So financially, this is a really successful time. In terms of controlling the country, again, he's got really quite good control over the country. He uses something called quo warranto to replace local officials with Tories. Obviously, the Tories are the political party who'd supported him during the exclusion crisis. He knows they're on his side. They're very focused on divine rights, so they're very supportive of him. Quo warranto, it's just basically the privilege of the king to issue new positions, but also, replace them. So even though there would be people in that office, so a local JP, he could issue the quo warranto and it would call for a new JP to be chosen. So it's basically, quo warranto is a way of him firing people and hiring them legitimately, but he's obviously can hire his supporters. And it was about issuing new town charters. So the quo warranto basically renewed the town or city charter, and therefore he could replace the local officials. So it just gives him that way to put his supporters across the country in all those local offices. He also uses the Book of Orders, and this is something that Charles I had used. It's just like rules about tax collecting. So it's making sure he's getting all the taxes that he wants to be collected, and instead of having to make sure everyone knows exactly what they're doing, he sends out the Book of Orders. They can look in the book and they know exactly what taxes they're meant to be collecting. There was some issues, such as the Rye House plot. This was an attempt to kill Charles II. So this was the Whigs. They have a plot to kill him, but it is discovered and it stopped, and several Whigs are executed because of this. But there is that threat to him. The other thing that I mentioned is this idea that he does have to make some compromises to please the Tories, really. So because he can't run a country on his own. He doesn't have Parliament. He does need some people to help him, and he wants the Tories to continue helping him. So even though there's less Catholic persecution during arbitrary rule, because obviously, you know, they've just saved the Catholic future King James from exclusion, so he can sort of get away with persecuting Catholics less, but he does have to continue with persecuting dissenters. So specifically Quakers. 400 Quakers die in prison during arbitrary rule, you know, due to horrible treatment and the like unhealthy conditions in the prisons in England at this time. You know, he has to continue with that. That isn't something he would have wanted. Charles was very happy to have complete religious freedom, but he had to rein that in to try and please others. So his big kind of thing of compromise at this time was continuing with the Clarendon Code with regards to dissenters. But Catholics, you know, weren't really being fined, weren't really being arrested. It was mainly the dissenters that were being focused on. Interesting thing, obviously, Charles does convert on his deathbed. Was he Catholic all along, or did he just decide on his deathbed to become Catholic? If he'd secretly been Catholic this whole time, I think that really shows that he was committed to trying to keep peace in England. Because if he'd converted while he was alive, it would have led to huge uprisings and unrest. So maybe he really did only just do it on his deathbed. Interesting. The point is, Charles dies a powerful king. He prevented exclusion. He's financially strong. He is getting away with kind of persecuting Catholics less. He stops this plot to kill him, and he kind of takes control of the whole country by putting his supporting party, the Tories, into these local positions of power. He definitely dies kind of a really powerful king. And his brother does then become the next monarch.